Okay, so I mentioned yesterday that we would take a look at a section of the Biurim, which deals with the question of if I borrow something without permission, and I'm entitled to do so because it's something that people generally don't mind lending out, or I happen to know this particular individual would not mind if I borrowed this particular item. I'm confident about that. So we said that under those kinds of conditions, you are allowed to borrow something without the owner's permission. However, what if something happens in the course of using that item for its intended purpose, which is what we would call Mesa Machmas Malacha. So the Imrei Yaakov had told us that you would still be liable, even though normally a shoel, a person who borrows an item, like a donkey, and then in the course of normal work, plowing, schlepping, whatever, the donkey dies, the shoel is putter, because that's called Mesa Machmas Malacha. But over here, you're going to be chayv. And he said, I refer you to the biurim over here. In just looking it over beforehand, I recall that we actually did this piece. We did this piece before Pesach, and basically it was very revelatory, this piece, because the question that was asked was this: why is it that when I borrow something and it dies in the course of normal use, or it fails or it gets damaged in the course of normal use, that I is a shoel and putter? The answer that's provided by some of the Rishonim is because there's a certain negligence on behalf of the lender. If someone lends me an appliance or an animal that is going to break down in the course of regular use, then the person who owns it should not have lent it to me. In other words, if I have a lawnmower and I haven't properly maintained it, I haven't oiled it, and I haven't checked the rope that the pull rope to make sure that it's not frayed, and so forth and so on, and I end up lending it out, and the guy who, because I haven't used my lawnmower, let's say, in 6 months, and the guy who borrows it now, tries to start it up, and he pulls the rope, and the rope snaps all of a sudden, right? So the reason why he's not liable is because the owner of the lawnmower really didn't test it or maintain it properly when he lent it to me, and therefore I should not be held liable as a borrower. However, in a situation where I borrow something without asking permission, then you don't have that argument that there's a negligence on behalf of the lender because he never should have lent it out without first testing it. You understand? So that's the argument why when you borrow something, even legitimately without asking permission, you still will be liable for what we call Mesa Machmas Malacha. Okay, so that's where we are, and so we did Halacha Vav yesterday, and what we came out is what we were talking about in Halacha Vav is a scenario where you are about to incur a significant financial loss, and you can save your loss by taking, without permission, your friend's possession, and even causing financial loss to your friend's possession. So we saw essentially that there's a machlokes in the poskim as to whether even though that's the din of the Gemara says you're allowed to do this. If my honey is about to spill out of my cracked container, I'm allowed to take my friend's container of wine, spill out the wine, and save my honey with that container. I just have to pay him back for the loss of the wine, which is much less than the loss of the honey. That's what the Gemara says. But there's a God-fearing person, however, we said, should be stringent and should try to avoid this at all costs. And whenever, even if you have to take a bigger loss, it's better to avoid this whenever possible. Just know that it is available to you halachically if there's a significant loss. Okay. In Halacha Zayin, the Rab Shulchan Aruch qualifies this further, and he says, "V'chol zeh b'chafatzim she'ein omdim lischar." He says, the aforementioned halacha was only with objects that are not meant to be rented out and to receive wages for their use. Aval chayfetz ha'omid lischar, shedarko shel ba'olav lahaskiru tamid lakol, ve'eno niskar ba'atzmo imo, mutar litlan mibeito shelo midaito v'litein haschar. He says, what we've been talking about now is borrowing objects from my neighbor without his permission, which I normally don't have a right to do, when we're dealing with personal effects of my neighbor, okay? His lawnmower, his gardening shears, his shaver, or whatever it is. He says these are things that he normally doesn't rent out. But let's say he runs a business that he rents out different garden appliances from his garage. He says, and normally ve'eno niskar ba'atzmo imo, and normally he doesn't accompany the appliance when it's leased out. So then mutar litlan mibeito shelo midaito v'litein haschar. So then it would always be permitted to borrow those things even without his knowledge, provided that I pay for whatever I rent. But obviously, if the owner is not present, but other members of the household or part of the company basically say, hey, you can't just take that. We need that appliance. The owner needs that appliance for himself, or he's already committed it to somebody else. So then obviously you would not be allowed to take it. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov and Membeis.
On that last point, Rabbi, is there an aspect of usually takes a security deposit? That's not the way he does business. So, you're just taking it without following the normal procedures of the rental.
Right. That's a very valid point. Let's see if there's any qualification here, and maybe we'll come back to that. In the Imrei Yaakov, she'ein omdim lischar, that these are appliances that normally are not meant to be leased. So then, under normal circumstances, I don't have a right to borrow them without asking permission unless I'm absolutely certain, right? V'lachein halokeach chamoro shel chavero she'eino omid lahaskiro shelo midaito va'osa bo malachto after kavanaso litein lo scharo havi kishol shelo midas v'havi gazlan. He says, if up until now, we've been talking about things that are not normally rented out. And therefore, if I borrow my friend's donkey without his knowledge, and I do whatever I need to get done with that donkey, even if I intend to pay him, okay, and I tell my friends, don't worry, I'm going to leave him cash for having borrowed his donkey. But that's not legitimate. You can't do that. You can't just, without the guy's knowledge, go ahead and take his donkey. You have no established pattern that he'd be prepared to lend out his donkey to other people. And you therefore are shol shalom midas, you're borrowing without permission, and that makes you into a gazlan. So the only time that you can really justify borrowing something that you don't have any knowledge about what the owner's attitude is about it, is when he already has an established pattern of lending out this item or leasing it out. And it doesn't matter whether you're prepared to pay for it or not. Just because you're prepared to pay for it does not justify stealing it. Right? There's even something called chamas in halacha, where you forcibly purchase something from someone. You can't go to someone's residence or business and say, I want to buy that vase or that piece of clothing. If the owner says it's not for sale, you can't say, I don't care if it's not for sale, I'm paying you for it and taking the item. That's gazela. That's stealing. Okay? But if it is something that's ha'omid lischar mutar litlan, If you do, however, encounter a situation where the guy generally does lease out his appliances or his animals, so then you would be allowed to take it even without his permission, as provided that you are prepared to pay for it. Upater me onsin delo havi gazlan, and therefore you would be putter from any kind of onus, any kind of mishap that happens because you're a socher, you're a renter. However, if the object depreciates over the course of normal use, you would be liable, which is counterintuitive. Now, why would you be liable? The reason is like this. Even though when you normally rent something and it breaks down or dies in the course of normal use, you're going to be pater. But because you took it without consulting with the owner first, you can't, the owner has no accusation of negligence can be lodged against him. Like I go into my neighbor's garage, and I know he regularly leases out lawnmowers. He's got a set of 3 or 4 lawnmowers that he regularly leases out. I take one of his lawnmowers and I say, okay, I'll pay him. And then it breaks or the rope snaps. Why can I not claim that he's liable? Because he didn't choose to give me that lawnmower. I took that lawnmower without knowing whether or not he had tested it first or maintained it properly. And therefore, I'm going to be liable for breaking the string or for damaging the motor, even if it was just over the course of normal use, because maybe the owner with that particular lawnmower had been planning to do maintenance on it, knew that he needed to change a gasket on the motor or something like that. And because I didn't consult with him before I took it, I'm going to be liable for any loss that occurs in the normal course of use. Therefore, if the damage, the cost of repairing the appliance is greater than the rental fee, the owner has a right to say, give me what the cost of repairing is of repairing it. You can't take that plus the rental fee because the guy didn't get full use out of it the way he wanted it. But nonetheless, he is going to be liable for whatever mishap occurs. So this is an unusual halacha, because what turns out is that normally when a person borrows an item, he's liable for all onsin. He's liable if he gets hit by lightning or a flash flood destroys it, but he's not going to be liable for meisa machmas malacha. But here's a scenario where it's just the opposite in halacha, where if it's meisa machmas malacha, the person will be liable, but if an onus happens to it, he will not be liable because he's paying for the rental of the appliance. Okay, so this is one of those unique scenarios which runs counter to the normal course of affairs. Okay. So let's take a look at the next halacha. Mi shebikesh mechavero sheyaskir lo chadero lahachnis bo perosav. If a person asked his friend to lease to him a room, a space, I need a storage area to store my produce. Let's say I have a bunch of grain and I don't have enough room to store it, and you have a warehouse, and I ask to lease space in your warehouse to store my grain. Below ratza lahaskir lo, and the owner of the warehouse does not want to lease him out that space. V'hite'ehu ad shehichnisam lechedro shehivtiach lo eze davar v'chazar bo. So, and then the owner of the grain acts in an underhanded fashion. he basically deceives the owner, the warehouse owner, by promising him to do him a certain favor or to give him a certain incentive, and then he ends up never giving him that favor or incentive. Okay? Since he did this improperly, and he was deceptive, Rashaihu la'asos imo gamkein shelo kahogen likach mehaperos lischor polim bidomehem, and the owner of the warehouse is allowed to act in return in a way that would be less than proper under normal circumstances. So the owner of the warehouse now is in control of this guy's grain. He's allowed to go open up the guy's grain and use it as cash. And he can hire workers, to hire workers to remove the grain from the premises. And that's true even if the warehouse is normally meant to be leased out. And the owner of the grain is willing to pay the lease amount, but the owner just didn't want him in that premises unless he was willing to promise a certain thing, and the guy never made good on that promise. But he says, once I've evicted the guy from my premises and I've gotten his commodity out of my property, out of my warehouse, I have to notify him, hey, if you want your goods, you can find them in such and such a place in the marketplace. So basically, this is a real life situation where a person wants to rent a storage facility. It may be a certain kind of commodity that creates a nuisance. Maybe it's a certain kind of edible item that may cause, let's say, rodents to come to my warehouse. And I don't want to store grain. And the guy says, I promise you, I will get a fumigator and I will make sure that that there is a pest control comes and will not allow any critters or rodents to come to your warehouse. The guy says, if you can make good on that guarantee, then fine, I'll let you store your grain in my warehouse. And weeks go by, and the guy hasn't hired any pest control service, and the rats start coming, and the guy is at his wit's end. This is what's happening to my warehouse. I, as the warehouse owner, then have a right to turn around and take a portion of the grain, convert it to cash to cover my expenses of hiring people to remove the grain and to get rid of the mouse or the rodent infestation in order to make things good. And I can do that even without asking the owner of the grain. I'm within my halachic rights. But once I've removed his grain from my premises, I have to let him know where he can find it. Okay? Umidas chasidus, it would be considered to be an act of added piety, lahodia lebeistin kodem shiashlichem l'shuk, to notify the beis din of the city that I just want the beis din to know that I'm doing this, just as a courtesy. Maybe they'll reach out to the owner. Beis din yiskaru mimixas demehem eze cheder upoalim laholicham shama mishum mitzvahs hashavas aveda lebaalim afal pi sha'asa shelo kahogen. And the beis din will be able to take some of the money from the grain and use it to, let's say, find another facility and workers to transport the item. In other words, if the Beis Din's willing to do that in order to help save the guy some money, because what's going to happen if I end up tossing this guy's grain and just leaving it out in the marketplace or leaving it out on the side of the street, then who knows what can happen with it, right? Someone can take it. So an added act of piety would be to find some kind of communal organization that is willing to do an act of kindness, like the Beis Din, to take the grain, a portion of the grain, convert it into cash, use it to transport the item, and to find another facility to rent that is more outfitted to be able to store grain, and to store it there. And that would be in keeping with the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, of saving a significant loss for the owner. And that we would do even though the guy acted in an inappropriate way. Okay? In other words, I still have a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda to a person who has behaved inappropriately, even with that very commodity that stands to be lost.
Right to sell some of the grain or others offer fumigation. Does he not also have the right to take sell some of the grain for the time that that grain was stored there, and just has elapsed while he was just not dealing with the idea of dealing with the fumigation? So in the meantime, he's had benefit of storage space.
Well, the guy certainly has to pay for the storage space. He has to pay for the months that have elapsed of the time that he stored it. That he certainly has to pay for. Let's assume that he was paying his rent on a monthly basis, but he just wasn't. I told him, I don't want, my warehouse is not meant for storage of edible items, because I have other products here that I can't afford to have rodents come and chew cables that I'm storing for electronics companies and stuff like that. So the guy makes certain guarantees and never makes good on those guarantees. And then as a result of that, I have this infestation. What am I going to do? So I have to act quickly. Even though the guy was paying rent, I have a right to dump all of his possessions out of my warehouse, because the nuisance that has been created as a result of the storage of his goods has not been mitigated as he had promised. Okay. So this is an interesting real life scenario. Okay. So let's take a look. Getting back to your question, Paul, about, taking something without permission, but which normally is leased. The Imrei Yaakov did not address it directly, but it would stand to reason that if there are very specific terms of how the guy leases out appliances, then if I'm going to do it without his knowledge, I have to abide by those protocols. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mem Dalid in the Imrei Yaakov. Rashaihu lasos imo gamkein shelo kahogen. I have a right to, because this fellow used my facility to store his items inappropriately, because he made certain guarantees and promises that he did not keep. I'm allowed to behave with him inappropriately and dump his stuff out of my facility because he did not make good on his guarantees. Hi Dina Isa b'Gemara Perek HaShoel. So this halacha appears in the Gemara in Bava Metzia. Eitzel echad shekana sfina im yayin. Refer in the case in the Gemara is a guy purchases a boat together with wine. Velo matza makom lahanicham, and he didn't have any place to store the boat and the wine. Ubikesh meisha echas lahaskir lo makom below his schema, and he asked a woman for an area on her property to store the boat and the wine, and she did not agree. She did not consent. Halach v'kidsha leisha, va'az nasna lo makom lahachnisam. So he went ahead and promised to marry her and gave her kiddushin, and as a way of mollifying her. Okay, so he used the old Don Juan charm in order to be able to get some financial benefit from her. Okay, and then because he gave her kiddushin and basically showed his intent of being her husband, she consented to let him store the stuff on her property. Halach lebeso v'kasav laget v'shalach la. And as soon as he put the stuff in storage on her property, he went home, had a get written, and sent it to her. So when she saw that, Holcha v'sachra savolim v'shilma lahem mehayayin hanal v'hotziim chutz lebesa. So once she found the get in her mail, so she went and hired workers and compensated them with the barrels of wine that were in storage. And she had the boat and the wine removed from her house. The Gemara says this guy made certain guarantees and promises that he did not keep. And as a result, whatever he did inappropriate shall be done back to him. And he gets basically what he deserves. Right?
It sounds like a great plot for a movie, Rabbi.
Yeah, it sure does. At least for one episode at least for one part of the book or the movie.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, but basically the guy he poured on the charm, made certain guarantees, and never made good on them. The kasbu aposkim the dafka ki haygavna dahach isha shelo hayadaita lahaskiro lahai elam mipnei shekidsha. He says the poskim clarify this case, and they say that in this kind of scenario where the woman was not prepared to give up of her storage space for this purpose, and it was the only reason why she consented was because he was prepared to be her husband. The gilsa daito mikodam, and she was clear. Like, in other words, there was no lack of communication, right? In other words, he said, I'd like to store my stuff on your property. She said, no, my property is not meant for that purpose. I don't want to give you that part of my property. And then he said, well, if you are nice to me, I'll marry you. And so it was very clear that what she wanted and what he wanted. Aval ilu hiskira lo stam mikodem v'achar kach kidsha v'girsha ein biyad lasos came. He says, but if he poured on the charm and made no guarantees, but just like intimated that he was interested in her romantically, and as a result, she let him use the space, but without making it clear that she was only doing so because she thought that he would marry her. And then let's say after he moves his stuff in, he gives her kiddushin and then divorces her. And then she becomes upset with him, right? Then she doesn't have a right in that situation to take action, right? Why? And we'll continue this in Mirz Hashem tomorrow, but the answer is obvious. There was no representation made on behalf of this charmer that it was a clear quid pro quo, that in exchange for letting me store my stuff on your property, I'm going to marry you. He never made such promises. He may have intimated or suggested as such by pouring on the charm, but if he never explicitly made this guarantee, then she has no legal recourse against him, despite the fact that she feels exploited and her heart is broken and hell hath no
that was the expression I was looking for.
Fury like a woman scorned.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll hold it
I
here.
don't know whether, Rabbi, we can ask tomorrow about paying a kasuba as well on that, and how much that would be and whether that would cover.
Well, there is no ksuva here yet. Right?
Oh, he didn't marry her?
Well, he presented her with kiddushin, but the ksuva
So
is
he,
not due until the nisuin.
so he needed a get for that, did he?
Yeah. Hmm.
Okay, I didn't.
Yeah. Okay. Well,